Welcome back, everybody. Welcome back to my video series on performing scheduled maintenance on the Harley Davidson Pan America. In my previous videos, I covered things like inspecting and adjusting and lubricating the front end controls, adjusting the clutch, inspecting your cooling system, inspecting and adjusting the front end steering bearings, checking out the wheels, checking out the brake system, right? So for all of those checks and more, be sure to watch my first two videos. In this video, we're going to start off with inspecting and cleaning the air filter element, which means we need to first remove the fuel tank. So from the work I've done already, I already have the plastic fuel console trim piece removed. I have the seats taken off the bike already. And of course, the front nose fairing is already off the bike. Next thing we need to do to take off the fuel tank is first disconnect the main fuse of the bike, which is located right behind this panel back in here. It's a T25 screw holding that panel in. So we'll go ahead and remove that screw and then move that panel. So there's your main fuse right in here, and we can unclip the yellow holders in a little black plastic clip. You can unclip that and pull it out a little bit to make it easier to get to. Right? Now before we actually go and pull that out, the service manual states that the bike should be powered on. The ignition should be on, and you should have your key fob on you so that when you do this, the security system on the bike is disarmed. All right, so once the system is done booting up, if you will, we can now reach down in here and pull that fuse out. There we go. As soon as you do that, the bike should shut off. There's this little tab here that reaches over that you may have to pull that back in order to pop the fuse out. That's holding it in there a little bit. All right, so now we got the fuse out of there. Next, we're going to disconnect the main fuel line. Now, the service manual has a procedure for purging the pressure in the fuel system, and that requires the Digital Tech 2, the computer that Harley Davidson dealers use when they service these bikes. Essentially, you hook up the computer and you disable the fuel pump while cranking the engine to make sure that you relieve any excess pressure that's in there. I don't have that equipment available, so we're going to do it the old-fashioned way, which is just disconnect the fuel pump, disconnect the fuel line, I should say, while having a rag handy and a container to catch any fuel that happens to leak out. So to start with, we're going to remove this little plastic cover, and that just pops off. Just kind of give it a little wiggle, pull it straight out, and here we go. And then your fuel line is right under here. There's your fuel line disconnect under here, and it has a metal sleeve that you're going to push towards the motorcycle, push it away from you, and then that will pop off the fuel line. Now I'm going to do that with a rag covering it just in case there's any fuel pressure so it doesn't come spraying out at me. Alright, and I'm feeling a little bit of fuel leaking, as is expected, but I'm not getting sprayed, which is good. Alright, disconnect it. Put a little container there to let any excess drip down. Alright, not really much in there. And here you can see a better view of the connector and that disconnect fitting. Coming back over to the left-hand side of the bike, if I move the bars out of the way, of course I already have the center console plastic piece taken off, so that is just two screws on the front that hold that on, and it pops off. You can check out my last video to see more details on that. And then we're going to be disconnecting a few things in here. We need to disconnect the wire harness for the fuel level sensor, and then there's a vent tube down here. Right in here underneath this frame tube, right here is the electrical connector we need to disconnect. All right, I'm going to try my best to do this without blocking the view of the camera, but essentially this little gray tab needs to be slid out that way. There we go. Once that slides out like that, you can then push down on that. I know my hand's in the way, but there's not a lot of room in here. That lets you push down and pull that connector off. There. Hopefully now you can see that better. Like that. One of the easiest ways, at least that I have found, to get access to disconnect that connector from the mounting bracket is from here. Use a little plastic pry tool to come around this way that you can get underneath where that connector is on the bracket, and then there's just enough room back behind the frame where it mounts to the engine guard, and you should be able to feel the back end of that connector, and then as you use the plastic wedge on the front to disengage that tab, you can push forward to free that connector. Okay, get in there, separate them a little bit. Separate that little plastic tab that's holding that connector on, and then you should be able to push the connector forward just like that. Once you got this guy free of the bracket, you can just reach in there and pull out the wire and try and fish it up and around any other wires or cables until you're able to pull that wire all the way out and have it free, going straight to this zip-tied bundle going up to the fuel cap. Next, we need to disconnect a vent line that's over here. And at least on mine, it's a US model, non-California emissions model bike. There's two lines coming out of the fuel cap up here, and if you follow them down in front of the tank, there's also that wire that we just disconnected. One of these vents just ends open to the atmosphere, and then the other one continues and is clamped to another hose right down here. Okay, so that's what we need to disconnect. All right, so these are one-time use ear clamps, and they can be a little tricky to take off. All right, so I'm going to try my best to undo this without blocking the camera. Get this little flat screwdriver in there and just kind of work at it to expand it. As you can see, they can be a little tricky. Of course, being careful that you don't send your screwdriver off stabbing something you don't want to. There we go. I think we got her. Yeah. All right. Hopefully you can see how that's coming apart. There we go. So that clamp is completely gone now. And we should be able to just pop that hose right out of there. There we go. So sorry for blocking the camera, but I think you get the idea there. Alright, so with those, both the wire and that vent hose disconnected, you should be able to just reach behind here, trace them down from the fuel cap, pull them all out, and make sure that you can swing them up and out of the way like so. Next, I'm going to remove these little side plastic covers. Now, the service manual doesn't call for removing these to take the tank off, and in fact, I've taken the tank off without pulling these, but I find that it just makes it a little easier, gives you a little bit more room when you got to squeeze in under here to disconnect the fuel pump. So if you saw my last video, or maybe it was the first one of my last videos, I mentioned about the factory toolkit having a long torque screw that works perfect for getting to this one, since I don't have any torque bits long enough to reach down in there. So that's what I got right now. And then, so we'll loosen those up. All right. And then I'll set that aside and do the other side as well. Next, I'm going to remove the front mounting bolts of the tank. But before I do that, I like to get some painter's tape and wrap it around the crash bars here and a little bit underneath this curved part of the tank, because I've found that as I'm doing this, the tank will come down and rest on these crash bars. So it's just something to help keep them from getting scratched up. And while I'm here with my painter's tape handy, I'm going to go ahead and tape these hoses and wires up here out of the way so they don't get tangled up as I'm trying to, when I go to pull the tank off the bike. Alright, and then just remember to hit the other side. The fuel tank is mounted to the chassis in 3 spots. There's 1 bolt in the back, and then there's 2 bolts, one on either side, up at the front, right? And there's holes, access holes in the tubing of the chassis here to get to those bolts. So let me bring you in for a closer look. Right up in here is the access hole to get to that front bolt on the left-hand side. And it's a little bit of a blind access. You can't, it's really difficult to see up in there. So just carefully, it's a T30. They're not in there super tight. It's a relatively low torque spec. And there we go. And now we do the same thing on the other side. All right, on the right side you can see the head of the bolt. It's a good bit easier to see where it goes through the chassis on this side. So the same thing, just get that T30 bit lined up in there. And now since the other side's undone, the weight of the tank is coming down, so holding it up a little bit while you back it the rest of the way out helps. There we go, and we'll carefully let the tank rest down. If you prefer using hex sockets instead of Torques, those front tank bolts happen to be 10mm hex, so you could use that as well. It's the same as what's on the bolt holding the rear of the tank. It's a 10mm, also has the same T30 on the one side and a 13mm nut on the other side that we're going to undo. So recall that I took those plastic side cover pieces off, and the screws that secured those down also secured this plate to the chassis of the motorcycle. So this tank is already loose right now. We're going to go ahead and still disconnect this bolt from this mounting plate. Alright, and then carefully pull that out and set it aside. So now the tank is free of the bike, it's just sitting here. We need to disconnect the wire connector going to the fuel pump and fish out that fuel line. I'm going to lift up on the tank and put a 2x4 under here just to help support it. Around this fuel line, I wrapped a piece of wire, taped it up, so that it can act as a pull cable when I go to fish this back through. Alright, so now we're ready to disconnect the fuel pump, and this is a bit tricky to do. It's even trickier to catch on camera because it's a really tight angle here. So I'm going to try my best, and hopefully you can see what I'm doing as I do this. If not, I will show you what it looks like once I have it all done. There is a clip right here that needs to come undone, and my hand's probably blocking that view. And then that connector will come off. So, easier said than done. It's pretty tight quarters here. It's one of those things that once you do it a few times, you start to be able to get it by feel. And I'm going to try and do it where hopefully I'm not blocking the camera And you can see, but that might not work. I might have to get two hands up in here. Or the little locking piece is slid off, and then there's a little tab I can press and pull that connector off. There we go. So there it is. I'm sure my hand was completely blocking the view as I plucked that off. Sorry about that, but hopefully you can see now this little plastic lock slides back like how it is now, and then that releases where you can push that tab and pull that whole connector down. Alright, now I'm finally ready to remove the tank off the bike. It's just sitting here. Remember, we have that fuel line that's still snaked down through near the cylinders, near the engine, so we got to pull that out as we lift. And this is sitting on top of the airbox. Alright, so it's not just going to lift straight up. Also, if you have aftermarket risers that bring the bars back, I have the A1 cycle risers on here, you can still do this. Just notice that because those bars come back, you have a little bit less clearance to work with, right? So you just got to be careful and take that into mind. Alrighty, so let me get this board out of the way and find my fuel line. Alrighty, so. And it also helps that if your tank is not completely full of fuel when you're doing this. Alright, so you just kind of keep feeling and pulling at the fuel line, working that to get it loose so that you're not pulling on where it connects into the fuel pump. Alright, so now I have the other end of that fuel line in my hand. I know that's good, so now I can just carefully wiggle it off the airbox, bring it back, make sure nothing's caught, and there we go. And now we just set this safely out of the way. And now we're finally ready to pull the airbox cover. It's secured with T25 screws. So just start going around and undoing all those. And before lifting the cover off, make sure you disconnect this electrical sensor. And now we're ready to lift the airbox cover. If you're still running the factory air filter, it's going to look like this. Okay? I have upgraded to one of the Screaming Eagle filters. Once you have your airbox cover off, go ahead and cover up those intake stacks so that no dust, dirt, or anything accidentally falls down in there. And then loosen the clamp that's holding the air filter in. For the factory style filter, you're going to wash it in lukewarm water with a mild detergent. Let it dry. You can use light compressed air to blow it dry. You just make sure that you're blowing from the clean side out to flush out any dirt particles to the outside of the filter, which the way this mounts is in here, right? This is the dirty part, this is the clean part. And then you're going to shine a light up to it, and it's sufficiently clean when you can see the light evenly coming through the filter. And then reinstall it back on your bike. Or you can do what I did and just pitch this and go with the Screaming Eagle filter. For your Screaming Eagle K&N style filter, you're actually going to use a K&N filter cleaning kit, which is what Harley says to do in the instructions that come with this. So in that K&N cleaning kit, you're going to have a filter cleaner as well as the filter oil. So you take the filter cleaner, liberally apply it to the filter, and then give it a thorough rinsing, making sure to rinse from the clean side out to the dirty side to help rinse away any particles that's in the filter. Let it completely dry before moving on to oiling it. Then spray the filter with the oil. Then allow that oil to wick into the filter for about 20 minutes before reinstalling it on the bike. While I'm waiting for that air filter to dry, it's a good opportunity to take off the lower air box just so that we can have more access to inspect the rest of the motorcycle. First, remove this breather tube that goes to this bolt on the front head, like so. There's 8 bolts, they're T30, 8 of them that secure the lower air box, and I'm going to do them in the reverse order of the torque sequence that's in the service manual. And just carefully slide it out, making sure not to get caught on anything on the way out. All right. Cover your throttle bodies. Make sure nothing gets down in there. With the top end of the bike disassembled like this, it opens up a few more things that you can inspect while you're here. You can inspect the fuel lines going into the throttle bodies here. Look and see if there's any evidence of fuel leaking. And then you can also inspect the rest of the brake line that's going from the front of the bike to the rear ABS pump. Also, while I'm here with the bike in this state, let me show you where the spark plugs are. I'm not due for spark plugs. Spark plugs are to be done every 10,000 miles or every 2 years. Now, 2 of them are pretty obvious. Outboard here, rear cylinder, front cylinder, right? But there's another set of spark plugs on this bike. So each cylinder has 2 plugs. And the second plug for your front cylinder is going to be here. It's underneath this coil pack, so you'll have to disconnect that wiring and remove the coil pack to get to the plug underneath. And it's a similar story for the rear cylinder as well. There's your coil pack, and the plug is directly underneath that coil pack. For this one, you'll likely have to remove the clamps holding these brake lines in place so that you can move to get a little bit more room to work when it's time to do your plugs. Before putting the lower air box back on the bike, give it a good cleaning. 50-50 mix of rubbing alcohol, isopropyl alcohol, and water, especially on the mating surfaces where it's going to connect over the throttle bodies and also inside the snorkel, around the breather hose, basically anywhere that you want to make sure you have a good clean mating and sealing surface. Wiping out the inside isn't a bad idea either, just to make sure that you don't have any dust or dirt that's going to potentially get back into the motor once you have this all assembled. All right, now we're ready to get this lower air box installed back on the bike. Make sure you pull out anything that you had in the throttle bodies, and then be careful as you go in with your air snorkel that it doesn't get caught on any of the wiring or connectors that's up there. And make sure that breather hose gets routed back in as well, so we can plug that back in. Make sure nothing's getting pinched, and that you have a good seat on top of the throttle bodies. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and plug up the inlets for those throttle bodies again, and I'm just going to get all these screws started in the proper torque sequence. So we start with the one over here on the right hand side of the bike, the most forwardmost one by the stack going into the throttle body. Not the one that's up here in this corner, but this one right there. So we'll go ahead and I'm just going to get those started by hand until they barely seat. And then we just kind of go in a clockwise order Try and get a better camera angle here for you for the order. So it's going to be that one first. We start there, and then the one in the middle between the two stacks on the right. Then down here we work our way and do this one there, then this one that's in the middle, and then this one, and then we finally come up to here and then over to there. So basically we're starting here and then clockwise around to the rest. Now we torque those screws down. We're going to do that in 2 passes, and the first pass is 35 to 44 inch-pounds, so I'm set to 40, and again we're starting right here on the right hand side, down from the screw that's furthest to the front, the one that's right to the top right of that intake stack. And then there's a click down to this one. Okay. All right. And the next pass is 44 to 62, so I'm going to bump up to 50. Okay, and the same sequence. There we go. And then just remember to put that breather hose back on.